The curtsy was perfect. Every young woman in that ballroom had spent the better part of the previous fortnight practicing it. Miss Cecily Morrow had done so in a borrowed mirror in the servants' passage at Ferncliff, the estate where she served as companion to Lady Ashworth. Because the mirror in her own small room showed only a woman from the chin down, and she had wanted, just this once, to see the whole of herself doing something properly. She had lowered herself the prescribed depth, held the angle of her chin, extended her right foot precisely so, and she had curtsied to the wrong man entirely. The ballroom at Grantfield Hall fell into a peculiar quality of silence, not the absolute silence of catastrophe, but the more terrible kind. The held breath of 200 people who have all seen the same thing and are waiting to see whether the person in the center of it will understand what she has done. Cecily did not understand. Not for one long, suspended moment. She was aware of the man before her. He was not the man she had believed him to be. He was tall, composed, with dark hair trimmed close, and features that suggested he had spent a great deal of his life controlling his expressions rather than surrendering to them. He wore a coat of deep charcoal gray rather than the uniform she had expected, and his eyes, when she dared to raise hers, held the quality of someone counting silently to an inward number. His jaw was set. His gaze, silver gray and extremely still, was fixed upon her with an attention that felt less like disapproval and more like the particular alertness of a man assessing a situation he had not anticipated. He was the Earl of Denmore. Behind him, 3 paces back and standing beneath a canopy of cream and gold that Cecily had not registered at all in her determination to find the correct position in the room, was His Most Serene Highness Prince Albrecht of Renwald, the guest of honor whose arrival from the continent had necessitated this evening's grand assembly, whose presence in England was a matter of diplomatic delicacy that Lord Ashworth had explained to her no fewer than 4 times in the carriage on the way here, and to whom she had now, by performing a formal court curtsy to his immediate companion, delivered what the assembled company could only interpret as a deliberate and studied slight. She had, as Lady Ashworth would inform her in a furious whisper before 10 minutes had elapsed, essentially told the Prince of Renwald that he was not worth acknowledging. This is the story of how Cecily Morrow did not flee the room, though every instinct she possessed urged her toward the nearest door. It is the story of what the Earl of Denmore did in the 7 seconds after her curtsy landed, and why that choice would cost him something considerable, and why she would spend the rest of that season certain she had misread it, and why she had not misread it at all. If the story of a single wrong curtsy reaching across a ballroom to change 2 lives entirely strikes you as the sort of thing you would like to stay for, then stay. You will not be disappointed. She was 23 years old and had been a companion for 11 months, which was long enough to understand the precise texture of invisibility a young woman of no fortune and minor breeding acquired in the houses of the gentry. Her father, a clergyman of modest scholarship and genuine warmth, had died in the previous winter, leaving her his library and his good opinion of her mind, neither of which paid the quarterly rent on the 2 rooms she and her mother occupied in Chelmsford. The position with Lady Ashworth had come through the intervention of her father's oldest friend and had been presented as a kindness, which it was, though kindnesses of this particular variety came with their own architecture of smallness. She sat at the corner of tables. She fetched things. She listened to Lady Ashworth's correspondence being read aloud and offered opinions that were then either taken without credit or dismissed with the phrase, "Yes, I think that is rather too simple." She was not unhappy. She was, however, acutely aware of her position, and it was this awareness that had produced the catastrophe of the curtsy. Lord Ashworth had told her to find the tall man in gray and make her acknowledgment early, before the crush makes it impossible. There were, she had discovered upon entering the ballroom, 3 tall men in gray coats. She had chosen the wrong one. The man she had identified as the Prince of Renwald was in fact his aide-de-camp, an English lord of middling rank, and the man she had curtsied to was the Earl of Denmore, Renwald's English liaison, who had been appointed to manage exactly this sort of protocol, and who now stood, very still, receiving a curtsy he had not asked for and could not refuse without making the situation considerably worse. And so, he had accepted it. That was the first thing Cecily would not be able to explain away. He had inclined his head. He had done so with complete gravity, as though a junior companion to a viscount's wife performing an unrequested court curtsy to him in front of 200 people was a thing that warranted the same measured courtesy he would extend to any formal acknowledgment. There was no amusement in it. There was no cruelty. There was only the specific dignity of a man who understood that the kindest thing he could do for a young woman in this moment was to receive her mistake as though it had been intended. She had not understood that yet. She had understood only, with dawning horror, the direction of every gaze in the room. Lady Ashworth materialized at her elbow with the speed of a woman who has spent 30 years attending events at which things could go wrong. "Come," she said very quietly, in a voice that was not unkind, but was extremely decisive. She steered Cecily toward the far end of the room, past the orchestra dais and the potted palms, away from the canopy and the prince and the 200 people who were now, mercifully, finding other things to look at. "I am sorry," Cecily said. "Yes," said Lady Ashworth. "I believe you are." She did not say anything else immediately, which was its own form of mercy. Then she said quietly, "Lord Denmore received it gracefully. That is the only reason the evening is recoverable." Cecily did not look back. She was aware, with the particular physical certainty that bypasses rational thought entirely, that the Earl of Denmore was still standing where she had left him, and that he had watched her cross the room. Lord Denmore. She had heard the name in passing, in the way one heard the names of significant men when one moved in houses where such men were discussed, as shorthand for a quality of authority, for a specific coldness, for the kind of social fluency that read as remoteness in those who did not know how to interpret it. She had not expected him to be young. Earls of his reputation tended, in her imagination, toward gray at the temples and the settled confidence of men who had long since stopped worrying about the impressions they made. The Earl of Denmore was perhaps 34, and he had the face of someone who had, at some specific point in the past, decided to stop permitting himself to be surprised. He was, Lady Ashworth had explained in the carriage, with slightly less patience than she had shown on the 3 previous subjects, acting in an official capacity as the British Crown's liaison to Prince Albrecht for the duration of the Renwald delegation's visit. It was a position of some delicacy, requiring him to manage an exceptional number of competing protocol concerns, and it was exactly the sort of position for which his reputation for controlled precision made him ideal. And the last thing he needed was a companion to a viscount's wife selecting him at random from the assembled company as the target of a formal Viennese court curtsy. "She is nobody," said Mrs. Portia Vane, at whose elbow Cecily found herself standing some 20 minutes later through no particular design of her own. Mrs. Vane said it to her companion, a woman in yellow silk whose name Cecily did not know, in the carrying murmur of a woman who has never fully believed that the people she discusses can hear. "Some Ashworth dependent, a clergyman's daughter, no connections. I cannot imagine what possessed her." The woman in yellow silk made a sound of measured sympathy. "She has nothing," Mrs. Vane continued. "The family is quite reduced. I believe the mother is in Chelmsford, which says everything." Cecily looked at the floor. It was very well polished. She could see, distorted in the gleam of it, the shapes of people moving around her, the arc of a candlelit chandelier, the ghostly suggestion of her own dark gown against the brightness of the room. She had heard this kind of assessment before. She understood its function. The dismissal of a woman who had made a visible mistake was not cruelty for its own sake. It was the social machinery restoring order to itself, identifying the disruption, and returning it to its correct category of irrelevance. Mrs. Vane was not a villain. She was a woman performing the role the evening required of her, and she was doing it competently. It did not make the words easier to stand inside. Cecily straightened. She found in her left hand a glass of ratafia she had accepted without noticing, and she drank a small amount of it and reminded herself that she had read Addison and Locke and 2 volumes of philosophy that her father had annotated in pencil, and that the opinion of Mrs. Vane regarding the significance of Chelmsford was not, philosophically speaking, load-bearing. She looked up and found the Earl of Denmore's eyes. He was across the room, attending to something a gentleman near the window was saying, and he was, by every visible indication, not looking at her. His gaze had shifted, very slightly. In the half-second she had raised her head, and the angle of it, the specific quality of stillness in his profile, suggested to her with no rational foundation whatsoever that he had, in fact, just looked away. She did not permit herself to interpret this. The remainder of the evening was, on its surface, unremarkable. She stood where Lady Ashworth required her to stand, assisted with the management of Lady Ashworth's fan and her shawl, and the small crisis of a loose thread in her glove. She was introduced to 3 people she would not see again. She ate a small quantity of food that tasted like nothing in particular, because her attention was occupied elsewhere, though she could not have said precisely where it was occupied, only that it was not available for the business of tasting things. Lord Denmore was presented to Prince Albrecht's party at 9:30, and she observed, from her position near the fireplace, the particular economy of his movements, nothing wasted, nothing performed for its own sake, a precise calibration of formality and ease that read, at a distance, as the posture of a man entirely comfortable with authority. He said something to one of the Renwald attendants, and the man laughed, though Denmore's own expression did not change. He turned. His gaze crossed the room with the methodical quality of a man who has learned to know where everyone is at all times, and it found her once, and held for one precise moment, and moved on. She told herself that meant nothing. She was quite good at telling herself that things meant nothing. It was when she was fetching Lady Ashworth's reticule from the side table near the entrance hall that she encountered him. She had not expected it. She had her attention on the table, on the specific cream silk reticule with the silver clasp, and she turned with it in her hand and found him not 3 feet away, speaking quietly to a young man in military dress who nodded and withdrew at a signal she did not catch. There was a brief interval in which neither of them spoke. "Miss Morrow," he said. His voice was low and carried the particular flatness of a man who does not often need to raise it. "My lord," she said, and felt with excruciating specificity the entire weight of the evening's earlier curtsy pressing itself into the 2 syllables. "I believe," he said, "that the fault of the evening lies entirely with the lighting in this room. It is impossible to distinguish one end of the canopy from the other." She looked at him. He said it with complete gravity. There was no wink in it, no conspiratorial edge, no indication that he found the situation comic. He said it as though he were reporting a factual deficiency in the management of Grantfield Hall, and had thought she might find the observation useful. "I see," she said after a moment. "His Highness," Denmore continued at the same measured pace, "has expressed a particular interest in the translation of the Linwith Psalter, which I understand is held in the Ferncliff Library. Lord Ashworth has kindly offered to arrange a viewing. I expect you will be present, given your position with Lady Ashworth." "I expect I will," she said, and did not understand, until he had inclined his head once and moved away, that he had just told her he expected to see her again, and that he had arranged the meeting so that there was nothing anyone could object to in the arrangement. She stood in the entrance hall for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, holding Lady Ashworth's reticule. Cecily did not sleep well that night. She lay in the narrow room at Ferncliff with the candle still burning, and her father's annotated lock open across her knees, and read the same paragraph 3 times without absorbing it, which she attributed to the general excitement of the evening, and not to any particular cause, because the particular cause seemed implausible on close examination. The Psalter viewing was arranged for the following Thursday. She spent the intervening days doing what she always did, accompanying Lady Ashworth, managing Lady Ashworth's correspondence, reading aloud in the evenings, and maintaining the surface of a woman whose interior life was organized and moderate. It was a surface she had constructed carefully since her father's death, because grief and constraint occupied the same architecture, and she had not wanted to mistake one for the other, and the construction had served her well enough until now. Now she found herself counting the days to Thursday, which was unlike her, and noticing it, which was uncomfortable. She also, because she was her father's daughter, and he had taught her to examine the evidence rather than the preferred interpretation, noticed the following facts, recorded as she might record the evidence of a text under examination: that the Earl of Denmore had not been obliged to speak to her in the entrance hall, that he had found a reason to do so, which provided her with a public occasion, and which placed the arrangement of that occasion entirely within Lord Ashworth's hands, so that she could not be accused of manufacturing proximity to a man above her station, that this was a quality of social intelligence that went beyond politeness and into something more deliberate, that she did not know what to do with this observation, and was therefore choosing, for the moment, to leave it unexamined. She was also aware that Mrs. Vane's assessment of her had circulated. She knew this, because Lady Ashworth's lady's maid had relayed it to the housekeeper in her hearing with the particular blandness of a woman who does not consider the companion to be fully present. The girl with no connections, the clergyman's daughter who had made herself conspicuous, the nobody who had managed to occupy Lord Denmore's attention for 30 seconds in an entrance hall. This last detail, apparently, was the most remarked upon, and it was remarked upon in the spirit of a social curiosity rather than an endorsement, the way one might note that a sparrow had landed briefly on the shoulder of a very large stone monument. Cecily thought, with a precision she had trained herself to apply to things that she found uncomfortable, that the stone monument in this metaphor was perhaps not precisely how she had experienced Lord Denmore, that his gravity had felt less like distance than like containment, that she could not account for this impression, and was not going to try. Thursday arrived. The Ferncliff Library was a long room on the south side of the house with tall windows that admitted the winter light in flat silver sheets and shelves that ran from floor to ceiling on 3 sides. The Psalter was housed in the south corner in a locked case of mahogany and glass, and it had been brought out for the occasion on a table of dark felt, opened to the illuminated frontispiece, which showed the hand of God reaching through a field of blue and gold pigment that had kept its color for 600 years. Prince Albrecht was accompanied by 2 members of his delegation and spent perhaps 12 minutes with the Psalter before his interest moved to the hunting prints on the far wall, as interests frequently did. Lord Denmore was not looking at the hunting prints. He stood at the near end of the felt table, and Cecily stood at the far end because she had positioned herself there as a matter of occupational habit, near enough to be of use to Lady Ashworth, but far enough from the point of interest to be technically peripheral. She was looking at the Psalter. It was, genuinely, a beautiful thing. The blue pigment in the illuminations was lapis lazuli ground fine, her father had told her once, extracted from stones carried across the whole of the known medieval world to land eventually in a monastery in Lincolnshire and become the color of the hand of God. "You are reading it," Denmore said from the other end of the table. She looked up. He was watching her with the focused quality she was beginning to understand was not coldness, but attention. "The marginal notes," she said. "They are in Latin, but whoever made them was adding a personal gloss. This word here, in the second column, is not the standard Vulgate reading. Someone disagreed with the translator." A silence. "What does the disagreement concern?" he said. "The nature of mercy," she said. "Whether it is given freely or whether it is earned." He looked at her for a moment. "And the annotator's conclusion?" "He appears to have held that it is given freely," she said. But the original text's translator thought otherwise. She was aware that she was discussing medieval Latin theology with a man she barely knew across a table in her employer's library while a visiting foreign prince looked at hunting prints, and that this was not a conventional use of a Thursday afternoon. She was also aware, in the particular way the body knows things before the mind grants them permission, that he had crossed the length of the table while they spoke, and was now standing beside her rather than at the opposite end, and that the quality of the light from the south windows fell at this angle across his face, which showed her for the first time something she had not seen in the ballroom. There was a particular line between his brows. Not a frown, not tension. The kind of line a face develops when it has spent years holding something in, the mark of a long habit of careful containment, and beneath it, in the set of his eyes as he looked at the Psalter's marginal annotation, something that looked, in this specific angle of winter light, very much like a man who had once held a strong opinion about the nature of mercy and had since revised it at some cost. She did not ask. She did not have the right to ask, and she understood that, and she was careful with it. He said, quietly, and without looking up from the text, "Will you walk on the south terrace after luncheon, Miss Morrow? Lady Ashworth and the Prince's party are to take the East Wing tour, which runs long. There would be no impropriety in your taking some air in the meantime, and I am told the terrace overlooks the parterre garden, which is worth seeing in winter." She said, "I had not been told it was worth seeing in winter." "It is," he said, "if you have the right company." He said it the way he said everything, level, without ornament, without the performed wit she had learned to expect from men attempting to suggest interest. He said it as though it were simply true. She was outside on the south terrace at 2:30, watching the bare geometric hedges of the parterre hold their shape against the February cold, when he appeared. He wore his gray coat and no hat, which struck her as mildly irresponsible in this weather, but which she did not say aloud. They walked in a manner that was entirely proper. She was aware of the precise distance between them, which was the distance propriety required, and no less, and she was aware of how much she noticed it, which told her something she was not yet ready to acknowledge. He asked her about her father's library. She told him. He asked about the annotated volumes. Which ones? What subjects? She told him about the Locke and the 2 volumes of philosophy, and the running argument her father had maintained in pencil with a 17th-century divine across the margins of 3 separate editions of the same text. He did not tell her this was unusual for a clergyman's daughter, or imply that her acquaintance with these volumes was a thing requiring explanation. He listened the way people rarely listen, as though the information mattered and he intended to do something with it. She asked him, because her father had taught her that real conversation required something from both parties. "You have been in diplomatic service for some years, my lord." "Since I was 26, he said. "And before that?" He was quiet for a moment. They were at the far end of the terrace, where the balustrade gave onto the open view of the park. The cold had reddened her fingers even inside her gloves. "Before that," he said, "I was engaged to be married." She waited. "The engagement was long," he said. 7 years. She contracted a fever in the autumn of 1812 and died before the spring." He said it the way he said everything, level and without ornament, but she heard, in the specific flatness of it, the sound of a man who had long since learned that the level tone was the only way he could say this particular sentence without something happening to his voice. She was a woman of considerable intelligence, and she was, I think, the only person of my acquaintance who reliably told me when I was wrong. "And you have been finding substitutes for that service ever since," Cecily said, before she had thought about whether to say it. He turned to look at her. She met his gaze, which was the gray of winter water, and she found in it not the displeasure she expected, but something she could not quite name, something that looked like a man registering an impact and deciding what to do about it. "I have been finding substitutes," he said, "for a good deal of things." She became aware that her heart was doing something unreasonable, and that the parterre hedges were very bleak against the February sky, and that they had been standing too close together for too long, and that she did not want to move. "Miss Morrow," he said, and her given name, which he had never used until that moment, was not what he said. Not yet. But the sound of her surname in his voice had a quality that she felt in the cold air of the terrace, like a hand extended across a distance. "You are very cold." "I am quite all right," she said. "Come inside," he said. "Lady Ashworth will want you before the tour concludes." She went. She was aware, walking back along the south terrace with him 3 precise feet behind her, that he had placed his hand, for 1/2 second, at the small of her back at the step down from the terrace door, a thing so brief and so slight that it might have been courtesy and nothing more, and that her body had registered it with an attention wholly disproportionate to its duration. She told herself, that evening, with the lock open again across her knees, that she was reading too much into the behavior of a man who was, by the calculation of the world she lived in, unreachably beyond her station. That his attentiveness was the natural manner of a careful man, and not a particular direction. That she was the clergyman's daughter with no connections, and he was the Earl of Denmore, and she would be well advised to keep those 2 facts in their proper order. She was very logical about it. She went through the argument 3 times. It did not help. Mrs. Vane was at the Ashworth dinner the following week. She arrived with her husband and a woman Cecily did not know, and she placed herself in the drawing room with the particular deliberateness of someone who has made arrangements she considers satisfactory. Cecily was at the far end of the room performing her usual function of being usefully present when Mrs. Vane's voice reached her in a natural pause in the general conversation. "I am told," Mrs. Vane said to the woman beside her, "that Denmore took a turn on the terrace with the Ashworth companion at Thursday's Salter viewing. It is exactly the sort of thing one expects when a man in his position has been too long without female company. She is presentable enough, I suppose, if one does not object to the very obvious calculation of it. A girl with nothing to recommend her, and nothing to lose." The woman beside her said something that Cecily did not catch. "Oh, entirely," Mrs. Vane said. "These situations resolve themselves." He will make an offer to Louisa Hartley before the season ends. Anyone can see that. And whatever amusement he has found in the interim will pack its things and return to Chelmsford." She paused. Poor thing. Cecily looked at the fireplace. She had known, in the abstract, that this assessment existed. She had not known, until now, that it would arrange itself into such specific words and land with such specific weight. And she observed, with the methodical part of herself that continued to function even when the rest of her was not entirely sure what it was doing, that it hurt considerably more than she had anticipated, which told her something she had been not quite ready to know. Lord Denmore was not at the Ashworth dinner. She had not expected him to be, and she was grateful for this, because she would not have trusted, in that particular moment, the expression on her face. Lady Hartley's ball was the following Saturday. Louisa Hartley was 21 and extraordinarily pretty, with the confident manner of a young woman who has always occupied exactly the position she was designed for. And she was, Cecily had gathered from various sources, considered by the greater part of the season to be the obvious match for Denmore. The match made sense in every calculable dimension. She had everything the calculus required. She moved through the ballroom at Hartley House with the ease of a woman entirely at home in precisely this sort of room, and she was charming to exactly the right people. And when Denmore arrived, she turned toward him with the particular ease of a woman who has been expecting exactly this. Cecily was standing near the windows. She had come because Lady Ashworth had required her presence, and she had no capacity to refuse it, and she had spent the first hour of the evening deploying every available surface of her attention to the management of her expression. She had been largely successful. She watched Louisa Hartley and Lord Denmore exchange the formal courtesies of the evening. She watched him incline his head. She watched his gaze, once, cross the room in its methodical way, locate her, and hold for one quiet moment before Louisa Hartley said something and claimed his attention again. She looked away. She looked at the floor, which was very well polished, and found herself thinking, with a clarity that surprised her, that she was not without worth. That the clergyman's daughter who could read medieval Latin, and who had opinions about the nature of mercy, and who had stood on a cold February terrace and said an honest thing to a man who was not accustomed to honest things, was not, by any measure she respected, nobody. That Mrs. Vane's calculus was a real system operating in a real world, and that its conclusions about her prospects were probably accurate, but that accuracy and worth were not the same thing, and she had learned this at her father's knee, and she was not going to unlearn it now. She was, however, looking at the floor, and so she did not see what happened next until the quality of sound in the room changed. It was a particular sound, the specific cessation of several nearby conversations at once, accompanied by the soft percussion of glasses being set down and the shuffle of people adjusting their positions to obtain a better view. She raised her head. Lord Denmore was crossing the room. He was not crossing it toward Louisa Hartley, who stood near the fireplace, who was watching him with an expression that had frozen in its polite configuration, while the intelligence behind it recalculated rapidly. He was crossing it toward Cecily. 3 strides. 4. The room was very quiet in the vicinity of this transit. Mrs. Vane, she registered in her peripheral vision, had gone very still. The sentence she had been forming apparently suspended somewhere between thought and articulation. He stopped before her. He was very close, closer than propriety strictly required, and she looked up at him. And his face, which she had been reading for weeks as controlled and contained, was, in this particular moment, simply direct. Not warm in the effusive sense, not flushed with declaration. Just himself, looking at her, with the specific quality of a man who has made a decision and is at peace with the cost of it. "Miss Morrow," he said. "I would like to introduce you to my aunt, Lady Carew, who has been asking about the Linwith Psalter, and who I believe would find your knowledge of the marginalia extremely useful." There was a beat of absolute stillness. Then he said, quietly, in a voice pitched for her, and not for the room, "She is in the East drawing room. I've been looking for a reason to take you there all evening." She understood. He had given her first the public version. A perfectly ordinary introduction. A perfectly innocent reason for his crossing the room. Something the assembly could observe and report and find unremarkable. And then, beneath it, the real sentence. She said, "I would be glad to meet Lady Carew." He offered his arm. She took it. She was aware as they moved through the room together, and the conversations she had silenced resumed around them, that she had perhaps 20 seconds in which to manage her expression and find her breath and remind herself that she was the clergyman's daughter with no connections, and that this was a public room, and that she did not yet know what this meant. She used 15 of them on the breathing. She used the remaining 5 on the observation that his arm, under her gloved hand, was exactly as solid as she had imagined it would be, and that imagining it, apparently, was something she had been doing. Lady Carew was real. She was a small, sharp-eyed woman of 60 or so, who had strong opinions about the Linwith Psalter and about the state of medieval manuscript conservation in England generally, and who, it quickly became evident, had specifically asked Denmore about anyone who knew the marginalia, because she ran an informal correspondence with a scholar in Edinburgh on exactly this subject. The conversation was entirely genuine, and it lasted 20 minutes, and it was the best conversation Cecily had had since her father died. When it ended, Denmore returned her to Lady Ashworth's side. He held her hand a half-second longer at the release than was strictly necessary. "Cecily," he said. It was the first time. She met his eyes. "I will call on Lord Ashworth tomorrow morning," he said, "if you are willing." She understood what he was asking. She said, "I am willing." He inclined his head and withdrew. She watched him cross the room again, this time toward the door rather than toward anyone in it, and she understood that he was leaving, that he had come to the Hartley ball for the sole purpose of crossing it to find her, and that he was now leaving because there was nothing else here he needed. The room buzzed. She heard it, heard the specific frequency of 200 people recalibrating their understanding of what they had just witnessed. Mrs. Vane was silent. Louisa Hartley stood near the fireplace with a composed expression and a glass of champagne she did not drink, and Cecily looked at her once and found in her face not the humiliation she had feared, but something else, something quieter. A young woman who had believed a particular story about how her life would go, and who had just been told, by the most public possible means, that the story had a different conclusion. She did not gloat at her. She felt, for a moment, the particular sorrow of 2 women negotiating the same machinery from different positions, and she looked away. Lady Ashworth said, in Cecily's ear, "He called on Lord Ashworth this morning, in fact. He was very correct about it. I believe we both of us have been somewhat outmaneuvered." Cecily said nothing. She was occupied with the understanding, still arriving in stages, of what had happened. Lord Denmore called on Lord Ashworth the following morning, and also on the morning after that, and on the 3rd morning Lord Ashworth's solicitor was present, and the matter was discussed in the library while Cecily sat in the morning room with Lady Ashworth, and a piece of sewing she did not progress, and a cup of tea that grew cold. Lady Ashworth said nothing for a long time. Then she said, "He is a precise man, Lord Denmore. He will not have made this decision without being certain of it." "I know," said Cecily. "Are you certain?" Lady Ashworth asked, not unkindly. with the directness of a woman who has seen a good many situations of this kind and knows that certainty is not a thing to be performed. Cecily thought about the South Terrace and the Psalter and the word mercy and the way he had said she is in the East drawing room with the sentence underneath the sentence. She thought about the line between his brows and the specific loss he carried and the manner in which he had found, in the 7 years since, nothing that replaced what he had lost, and the manner in which she had, apparently and without designing it, constituted something he was not prepared to let pass without action. Yes, she said. She was. The arrangements were concluded within the fortnight. Lady Ashworth presented her with a proprietary warmth that she accepted gratefully. Mrs. Vane called with a courtesy so precisely calculated that it was itself a kind of acknowledgment, and Cecily received it with the same grace with which she received everything else about this turn of events, quietly, without triumph, with the specific steadiness of a woman who has known for a long time that being seen would feel, if it ever came, like coming in from the cold. The wedding was in March at the parish church near Denmore's estate in Wiltshire, small and deliberate by design, in the way that a careful man chooses everything. Lady Carew came. Prince Albrecht sent a letter expressing his personal felicitations, which Denmore read aloud to her with a dryness she was beginning to recognize as the closest he came to amusement, and she permitted herself to observe that her curtsy, in retrospect, had been the best aimed gesture of her life, and he said that he was inclined to agree. The estate in Wiltshire was called Carwick. It stood on the edge of a vale that held the remnants of snow in March, where the hedges were thick, and the library had 3 tall windows and shelves from floor to ceiling on 2 sides, and a fire that was lit when she arrived, which she understood, having come to understand him, was not an accident, but a specific form of welcome. She found, on the desk near the window, a small volume she did not recognize, bound in brown leather, with the title pressed in gilt so faded it was nearly gone. She opened it. The pages were annotated in pencil, not by her father, but in a different hand she had not seen before, precise, minimal, occasionally drawing a line beneath a phrase and writing beside it a single word or question. It was hers, he said from the doorway. My first annotator. He said it simply, without the careful flatness he had used in February, and she heard, for the first time, his voice at rest. I thought you might not mind sharing the library. She turned the pages carefully. The pencil note spoke to her of a woman of intelligence and opinion, someone who had read as though the text were a conversation rather than a monument. Someone who had, in this book and presumably others, left behind the particular shape of a mind that liked to argue. I do not mind at all, she said. She set the book down carefully, returned it to its place on the desk, and crossed the room. He had not moved from the doorway. She stood before him, and he looked at her with that quality of direct attention that she had come to understand was not containment exactly, or not only containment, but something more like the specific steadiness of a man who has decided he is allowed to want what he wants. She reached up and laid her hand against his jaw, which was exactly as grave and set as it had ever been, and felt beneath her palm the faint shift of tension releasing. I am very glad, she said, that I curtsied to you. Something moved in his face, something she had not seen there before, something warm and slow and entirely his. He covered her hand with his. I am, he said, considerably in the debt of poor lighting. Outside the library windows, the last snow of the season was beginning to give way, in the patches of south-facing ground, to the first thin suggestions of something green. The fire had settled to a steady warmth. On the desk, beside the brown leather volume, her father's annotated lock sat where she had left it when she packed, waiting to take up its argument with its neighbor on a new shelf, in a library that was now, without any particular ceremony, but with a completeness she had not known she was still capable of feeling, hers. If this story moved you, leave a thought in the comments. These quiet histories deserve to be heard. The snow outside the window held its peace. The fire did not go out.